Assalamu alaikum and hello. I would like to welcome all of you on the behalf of Association of Media and Communication Academic Professionals, Human Rights Chair, University of the Punjab and Purdue University. This is our webinar. This is our fifth webinar. The series of the webinar is One World, One Struggle. The idea behind this webinar series is that humanity is suffering from certain problems, certain issues, and whether it is genocide in Gaza or threats.
It looks like Dr. Bushra has frozen.
Yes, I think.
I'm sorry, I don't know where did I leave. I'm sorry, there was an internet problem. Hello?
Yes.
Am I back? I'm sorry. Okay. I'm sorry, I don't know where did I drop. But basically, the idea behind this One World, One webinar, One World, One struggle is that humanity is suffering from certain issues, and it is we together who can fix it. And the way we see it, that people all around the world are trying in their own humble ways to fix it. And what we would like is throughout these webinar series show that how we are together in it and how when we are united, we can make a difference, and we have been making a difference. So today's series is basically with reference to the common concern that we have with to our environmental issues and the way the threats that our Mother Earth is facing nowadays. So keeping that in mind, this webinar series is called Together for Tomorrow, Uniting for Sustainable Future. And again, the idea is that whenever we are concerned or worried, we have to work together. And it is now that we have to take the steps so that we can make a better future. After having said this, I would like to welcome Dr. Abida Ashraf, who's the Human Rights Chair of University of the Punjab, and also Dr. Lee Arts, who's a professor at Purdue University, who will be the hosts of this webinar. So I would like to request Dr. Abida Ashraf to begin the webinar and introduce our first panelist.
Thank you, Dr. Bushra. Today, we have come together to address the most pressing issues of our time, that is climate change, and the critical need for global cooperation towards a sustainable future. Before starting, I would like to encourage our audience and the participants to actively participate by writing their questions in Q&A box, and we will have a dedicated Q&A segment towards the end of the webinar, where our guest speakers will address the questions. So climate change has become one of the greatest challenges of the 21st century, as Dr. Bushra earlier mentioned. And Pakistan is a country that has made minimal contributions to the declining of this phenomena. Pakistan, however, experienced a very devastating climate change impacts, and especially in the form of floods. And in the recent flood that was in 2022, that covered almost 1/3 area of Pakistan. And this unjust situation highlights the need for a collective effort, that not only we need to address the root cause of climate change, but also provide the support required for countries on the front line of climate impact. The impact of climate change transcends sectoral boundaries and negatively affects all domains. People living in the regions of South Asia are 15 times more likely to be affected by climate change. And this thing demonstrates that climate change is threatening not only one region, but the entire planet. And not only one generation or our generation, but also future generations. One of the key problematic issues in applying environmental justice policies to the third world countries is a relative absence of environmental regulation and many loopholes allowing corporate sector and politicians to bypass environmental policies. So to enlighten our audience on this issue, we are honored to have with us a renowned environmental lawyer, Ahmad Rafay Alam. Mr. Alam has been at the forefront of climate change discussions and has actively contributed to the development of sustainable policies and practices in Pakistan and beyond. Let me introduce Mr. Alam. Mr. Alam is a Yale World Fellow and environmental activist. He has served as a member of the Punjab Environmental Protection Council and associated with several organizations such as International Center for Climate Change and Sustainable Development, the Planetary Security Initiative, and Integrity Watch Pakistan. He has served as chairman of the Lahore Electric Supply Company and Lahore Waste Management Company. He currently serves as a member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council, senior advisor to Air Quality Asia, and member of the Hisaar Foundation Think Tank on the rational use of water. His insights and experiences will provide us with a deeper understanding of the current climate crisis, and more importantly, the actions which are required to be taken collectively. We are delighted to have with us Professor Dr. Lee Arts as our co-host of this webinar. Dr. Lee is a professor of media studies and director of the Center for Global Studies at Purdue University Northwest. Professor Lee Arts earned his PhD from the University. Dr. Lee has published 12 books, including Global Media Dialogue, Industry, Politics and Culture, Spectacle and Diversity, Transnational Media and Global Culture, and The Pink Tide, Media Access and Political Power in Latin America. He has contributed dozens of book chapters and research articles on global media, US popular culture, media practices, and social movements. He regularly contributes to media platforms on topics ranging from contemporary politics and social movements to global popular culture. Thank you, Dr. Lee and Ahmad Rafay Alam for taking out time and joining us for this cause. And we also have with us Ms. Imrana Divana. Ms. Imrana is an accomplished architect, environmentalist, urbanist, and activist with extensive expertise in sustainable development, green governance, and climate justice. She holds a master's degree from MIT, a joint program with Harvard University. As a passionate activist, she leads efforts to protect Lahore's historical and environmental assets as the General Secretary of the Lahore Conservation Society and convener of the Lahore Bachao Tehreek. Ms. Divana has been a key advocate in legal battles, serving as amicus curiae at the Lahore High Court on issues related to urbanism, sustainable development, and heritage protection. Internationally, she represents Pakistan at UNESCO and ICOMOS, focusing on climate change and heritage conservation. In her professional capacity, she has contributed to global urban regeneration projects in New York and Kuala Lumpur, and currently heads the Climate Change, Environment and Sustainability Initiative at Beacon House National University, Lahore, Pakistan. Thank you, Ms. Imrana, for taking out time and joining us. Now I will request Professor Dr. Lee Arts to initiate the discussion and start posing questions to our first panelist, Sir Ahmad Rafay Alam. Over to you.
I'm so pleased that Rafay Alam has joined us today. So actually, I thought that we would start with some questions for Mr. Alam. Perhaps you could begin by explaining what some of the key obstacles and challenges for sustainability globally, and then what unique environmental barriers hinder Pakistan's progress towards sustainable development. I know it's a broad question, but maybe you can just give us an overview.
Well, thank you, Dr. Arts and Dr. Abida, for inviting me. It's an honor to be part of this panel. Some dear friends, Imrana and others as well. Let me, I came across a phrase today that I think perfectly encapsulates what I'm trying to say. And it's not that the system is broken and it needs to be fixed, but rather the system is working exactly as it was planned and it needs to be destroyed. Let me try and explain this, because we all know that the climate crisis and the issue of sustainability is one of greenhouse gases, the stuff that we dig out of the ground and burn, or the stuff that's produced whenever we pull something out of the ground and burn it for our energy and transport needs, produces a gas that heats up or traps the sun's rays in the atmosphere and leads to global warming. And compared to the Industrial Revolution, some people say we're about 1.3 degrees centigrade warmer on average. And what this sharp increase in temperature over a relatively short period of time has done and is doing is it's destabilized the Earth's ecosystem beyond a place where it can sustain human civilization. We have had a relatively stable ecosystem since the last ice age, something that we as a species could then work off of, doing things like inventing the wheel, domesticating the ox and the horse so that we could cultivate this wild grass wheat and produce food in excess so that we can have a civilization. Well, that's all over, because what I want to explain is that climate change isn't a problem. We know it's caused by greenhouse gases. We know the solution is a reduction in greenhouse gases. But what I want to posit is that it's not a problem as much as it is a symptom of overshoot and overconsumption. Right? So the system is working perfectly fine. It needs to be dismantled. This system and civilization that we're in has destabilized our ability as a civilization to continue on Earth as this civilization. The things will have to change very, very drastically. So firstly, the great obstacle and challenge in achieving sustainable development or a climate risk-free world is to identify the drivers of the climate crisis. The fact that this is a symptom of something that's much worse. And I'll put it to you that it's capitalism, which is, in my definition, the unaccountable exploitation of natural resources and human labor to produce profit for a handful of people at the expense of poverty for the vast majority of others. That and things like colonialism, which has been a historic extraction of wealth from one part of the world, exploitation of people. The patriarchy, where you need to have women in decision-making if you're going to have any sensible adaptation or mitigation policies. Consumption, the fact that 1% of the world's elite 10% of the world's richest people consume about 50% of the world's resources on a year-on basis. Things like this need to be identified and dismantled and replaced if we want to have a climate risk-free and sustainable future. Now, when it comes to Pakistan and its ecology is remarkable. We have the highest mountains in the world, thousands of glaciers, valleys, we've got plateaus, plains, rangelands, we've got a delta, all the ecosystems you can imagine, which are of course uniquely at risk of the climate crisis, each one distinctly. But this doesn't make Pakistan different from other countries. Every country in the world is vulnerable to the climate crisis and have their own unique ecosystems that are at threat. But if pressed, I would say there are two unique features of South Asia that make things worse, so to speak. And the first would be the sort of trough of land, this sort of hollow that's been created by the Hindu Kush Karakoram Himalayan mountains on the one hand, and the Deccan Plateau on the other, which basically means the Indo-Gangetic Plain in North India rests in a sort of trough, so to speak, which traps, especially throughout the year and especially in the winter, air pollution, making this North Indian region the most air polluted area in the world. Now, the WHO is on record saying that about 9 million people lose their lives every year prematurely because of air pollution. And I want to say that most of those people are concentrated in the cities of Asia and Africa. This is not an equal distribution. So it's us here in North India gravely at risk of air pollution caused by this unique sort of physiological characteristic of North India. And the second thing that we're very vulnerable for, and which can be a hamper to progress, is the fact that Pakistan has one major river system. Other country, India has 5. And although the Indus Basin has over 20 tributaries, its resources are the ones that we have exploited at least since the English colonial period till today, and forms the backbone of our economy. This basin is under threat because of the climate crisis. We're facing water shortages, food security issues, and so on and so forth, that make the water availability in this basin a question raises questions about the availability of this water in the near and medium future. What we need in Pakistan is to move beyond this dependence on the basin as the basis of our economy and try and be more imaginative about how we can use this water in a more efficient way that benefits Pakistanis better.
Thank you very much for that. We'll have some other questions to come back to. But Dr. Abida.
Thank you, Mr. Rafay. Mr. Rafay. Our next question is regarding the carbon credit scheme. So, to what extent do carbon credit schemes generally contribute to long-term emission reductions, or do they simply allow developed nations to outsource their climate responsibilities at the expense of sustainable development in countries like Pakistan?
I don't mean to be flippant, but the carbon credits don't work. You can't expect a capitalist solution to fix a problem created by capitalism itself. And yes, there are arguments that carbon credits allow countries and industries to, push their pollution somewhere else. But frankly, in the case of Pakistan, there hasn't been that many carbon credit projects for us to have experienced any of that. Really, the thing that's in the way of sustainable development in Pakistan isn't things like carbon credits, but actually poor governance. If we had better governance, a more functional democracy in Pakistan, we'd be less climate vulnerable and much more resilient.
Thank you. Rafay, I would like to come back to the point you made about capitalism. I really appreciate your focus on capitalism. In particular, when we think about how corporations have responded to some of the concerns about climate, it's called greenwashing, where a company like BP, British Petroleum, tries to market itself as beyond petroleum, and they're going to make major investments in sustainable development or sustainable sources of energy. So I guess the question is here, how can the general public, consumers, climate organizations, environmental organizations, and even regulatory bodies like in Pakistan, distinguish between authentic environmental efforts and misleading claims by global corporations trying to greenwash themselves?
I completely get where you're coming from, Dr. Arts. As a matter of fact, Imrana and I have worked together against an urban development project in Lahore called the Ravi Urban Development Authority project, which aims to take over 100,000 acres of agricultural land and basically flip it as high-end real estate. But their advertisements all state that they're going to clean the water in the air and that the Ruda project is actually miraculously going to improve the environment of the city of Lahore. It's very difficult to see through this, especially if the propaganda and brainwashing is strong. Now, it's well reported and well there are books that have been written about how when Jimmy Carter was president, he received the first memo, the White House received its first memo about the scale and the risks of the climate crisis. And within weeks, major corporations had set up lobby firms or paying lobbyists to distract from that message. The fact that solar panels went on the roof of the White House in 1978 and came off during the Reagan era shows how powerful these corporations are in having their message basically distort what reality is. You know, we also live in a world where if you're making money, no one asks any questions. For instance, the Shell Corporation, right, who also claim to be into renewable energy, when in fact in 2022, when Pakistan suffered a devastating flood that displaced over 30 million people, you know, there's an attribution science study from Imperial College London that suggests that up to 50% of the intensity of the rains that fell over Pakistan, and we're talking 400, 800% of monthly averages that fell in a matter of days in parts of Pakistan where it doesn't normally rain, causing a lake over 100 kilometers to be formed that could be seen from space. That wasn't a natural flood. That was a man-made rain that cost Pakistan in excess of $35 billion in infrastructure loss. I mentioned Shell because that company in 2022 posted a $40 billion profit, right? 1 year's profit from Shell could have compensated all of Pakistan's infrastructure damage from very much a man-made fossil fuel-driven catastrophe. Greenwashing is rampant. We've been lied to about the effects. For example, we've been lied to about recycling. The fact that there's all this emphasis on individual recycling that will somehow miraculously cure the billions of pounds of plastic that's produced on Earth, mostly for, you know, high-end fashion and to be going into the garbage very quickly. This is very much a problem, and this obfuscation needs to be identified and dismantled. As I said earlier, you've got to figure out what the drivers of the climate crisis are, and these corporations and the money they're making have for years kept the public and their awareness away from what the reality of the climate crisis is. I mean, we're told today that 40 years ago, had we started doing something, we would have only had to have moderate efforts to reduce greenhouse gases. But now in 2024, you've got to completely dismantle how the world works right now and retool it in order to have even a half a chance of having a sustainable future. So you've got to look past these lies. And I'm not too sure how you can do that, especially when the propaganda is so strong and prevalent in everywhere.
Yeah, the media tends to tell us that it's up to the individual consumer to make an adjustment. So I hear what you're saying. Thank you for that.
Thank you. So with reference to the climate finance and what are the key commitments of the Paris Agreement, and how does the Paris Agreement address the need for climate finance? And what specific mechanisms are in place to ensure that developing countries like Pakistan receive adequate funding to meet their climate goals?
Well, you recall that the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change from 1992 is the basic legal document under which things like the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement have been executed. The objective of the UNFCCC was to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions, and that was in 1992. And in about 94, 95, under the Kyoto Protocol, that objective was set to ensure that there would be no global warming beyond 2 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels. And if you recall, George Bush Sr. famously stepped out of the Kyoto Protocol, stating that he wouldn't do anything to change America's way of life. And it wasn't many, many years later, and campaigning mostly by small island states who felt that a 2-degree warming was not compatible with their existence on Earth, given the amount of sea level rise that would be expected. So they lobbied the international community to enhance the sort of, you could say, ambition of the UNFCCC to make sure that temperatures wouldn't rise beyond 1.5 degrees centigrade compared to pre-industrial levels. And that was the key commitment of the Paris Agreement, to make sure temperatures didn't rise beyond 1.5 degrees. And you have to realize that's when John Kerry was the you could say, foreign minister of the United States. And when he was in Paris helping negotiate the treaty with a Republican Senate in the United States at the time, his argument was that America couldn't ratify this agreement unless because Kyoto was mandatory unless the Paris Agreement was made voluntary. So although the ambition of the Paris Agreement was greater than that of Kyoto, it was at the end of the day a voluntary arrangement made so that the United States would be able to ratify the Paris Agreement, which exactly what Paris was. But then, of course, if you recall, when Donald Trump became president, one of the first executive actions he took was to step away from the Paris Agreement. So America's role in, although being one of the largest polluters on Earth, not being part of the UNFCCC system for so long, deserves to be pointed at over there. But the Paris Agreement, number one, 1.5 degrees of warming. Number two, to reduce greenhouse gases. Number three, to enhance adaptation, especially in less developed countries, through the means of climate finance. Climate finance is one of the important commitments, not just of the Paris Agreement, but of the entire UNFCCC process, which recognizes that it is the greenhouse gases and development of the global north that is having a disproportionate impact on the poorer countries of the global majority. So that's, finance is important, but look what's happened. You know, we're probably going to breach 1.5 degrees of global warming by the end of this decade because the promises of mitigation and reducing greenhouse gases have demonstrably not been met by any of the major countries and emitters. And talk about finance. Climate finance was promised in Cancun in 2011, where the G20 countries got together and committed to capitalizing a global climate fund of $100 billion by 2020. It's 2024 today, and the Global Climate Fund has barely been capitalized beyond $14 billion, 1-4. And just to put this into perspective for you, the United States in this year, April alone, gave Ukraine and Israel over $90 billion, 9-0, multiples of what's currently in the Global Climate Fund. Now, there's money for imperialism and there's money to be carried out for genocide. And this is important because right now, as we see, if the international community is helpless, if international law is helpless in the face of the genocide in Gaza, what do you think it's going to do with the global genocide faced by people in the global majority because of the climate crisis?
Thank you, Rafay Alam. I wonder if you could talk a bit about the impacts of climate change that are occurring currently in Pakistan, in particular, how it exacerbates existing socioeconomic inequalities. And then I wonder, having presented us with some information on that, what strategies, short of replacing the capitalist and corporate environment, which seeks to make profits from sales of all kinds of products, everything from plastics to wraps to gasoline. And I also appreciate your point about the war in Ukraine and the war in Gaza, both of which have created environmental catastrophes across both of those regions. So I guess maybe you could begin by highlighting some of the impacts of climate change in Pakistan, and then a brief discussion on what strategies are possible to adapt to climate change or to overcome that climate change that currently exists.
Well, Dr. Arts, I'll try and answer the easy part of that question by describing some of the challenges Pakistan is facing. The first is that with increasing temperatures, the monsoon, which is the definitive weather of South Asia, monsoon means rain in Sanskrit, and it comes rolling on as the summers grow in, and it provides precipitation throughout the continent and winds up, incidentally, as the ice caps in the HKH glaciers as well. Increased temperatures are impacting the monsoon, its intensity and its duration and its location as well. So we're seeing unprecedented rains in places where it didn't rain, less rain in places where it usually rained. And so we're seeing massive flooding. At the same time, we're seeing droughts as well. In 2022, when the floods hit in August and September, I have to recall that in April that year, in March and April that year, Pakistan was hit by an unprecedented heat wave and water shortages. So we're also facing water shortages. And between the two, because of the fact that we use the Indus Basin primarily for agriculture, this has a devastating impact, not just on farmers' livelihoods and incomes, but also on food productivity and food security, especially going forward. This increased temperature, other than impacting crops, is also having an effect in urban areas. This year, the Asian heat wave was no joke. Over 500 people were reported to have lost their lives in the city of Karachi in just the month of June. And there was a week-long heat wave in 2014 in Karachi that saw the loss of over 1,000 lives. And I fear greatly as temperatures increase, without appropriate heat wave management plans, there's the risk of not hundreds or thousands, but literally tens of thousands of people being exposed to levels of heat that their bodies just can't adapt to or absorb. And so mass deaths in the form of heat waves going forward. And of course, especially in North India, the area of South Asia where I live, air pollution. Now, air pollution in this part of the world isn't necessarily the fault of the global north. It's the fault of the very many coal-fired power plants, the fact that we have some of the dirtiest fuels on the face of the earth, uncontrolled industry using all sorts of low-quality fuels that is exacerbating air pollution. You know, and this is not just an abstract. WHO says 9 million people prematurely lose their lives. This winter, there was a pneumonia epidemic in Punjab, and now pneumonia is a respiratory issue, but it's exacerbated by air pollution. Over 250 children died in Lahore alone in the month of January this year. You know, and a huge chunk of that, you can do the research, it's about 70% of pneumonia deaths are caused by air pollution. There are children dying because of air pollution. So it's flooding, both urban and rural. We have heat waves, which are going to cause droughts and challenges in urban areas, and we've got air pollution. And to make matters worse, as it were, we have very bad governance. So, for instance, when 30 million Pakistanis were displaced by floods of biblical proportions in the summer of 2022, you would have thought that all hands would have been on deck on rescue and rehabilitation of people impacted by the floods. But do you know that September, the Pakistani army bought $450 million worth of high-quality military aircraft from the United States? You know, that's poor governance. The fact that when we know that heat wave is going to be a challenge for lives moving forward, most of the infrastructure development in our cities tends towards favoring automobiles through the forms of overpasses and underpasses and highways, things that we know will make the city warmer. It's this poor governance that exacerbates the other risks that we have. And in many ways, I feel that one of the solutions to the climate crisis in Pakistan would be better governance. And I suppose I can extrapolate from that and attempt to provide an answer to your second question, which is what we should do. Well, I think you also identified, and I'm certainly on this side, that you've got to dismantle this machine. This machine is working perfectly for the urban elites in the world that are benefiting from it. It has to be dismantled for the benefit of the rest of humanity. And in order to do that, you need to have a collective political solution to this that isn't capitalist. It's anti-patriarchal, it's anti-colonial, and it's anti-consumer. So almost a new morality needs to be evolved to be able to identify where the good and bad of the future is going to be, so we know which side we're going to fight on.
Thank you for that, and stressing the fact that there has to be an ethic of common good and cooperation and collaboration. That's really inspiring, actually, for me.
Thank you.
Dr. Abida?
Yes, Ms. Imrana, she's our the panelist on this topic.
Thank you. Yeah, and it's okay. Thank you, Imrana, for taking out the time. And I know Imrana personally, and I really admire the passion with which she's working. Ahmad Rafay, thank you very much for pointing out that we cannot do some cosmetic effects to address the climate concerns and the environmental concerns. We have to look deeper into the structures that are responsible for that. And from your talk, I gather that if we continue with the capitalism or the economic systems that we have, we might be facing this problem more. But when it comes to Ms. Imrana, I feel that within the system and within the structures, she does fight, and she is trying to make a difference. And I don't know how far the effects of her very passionate efforts will take us, but we are hopeful because we feel that these small steps do make a difference. So, Imrana, thank you very much once again. As the convener of the Lahore Bachao Tehreek and the Daraft Bachao movement, you've played a crucial role in winning court cases to protect Lahore's environment. What inspired you to get involved in these movements? What challenges did you face? And how did collaboration contribute to their success? So I was just wondering if you could answer us here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. I'd like to thank Dr. Bushra, Dr. Abida, and Dr. Lee for giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts today on what we feel is critical to saving the planet. I mean, if I could just put it simply, I think that we don't have a choice anymore, that where the irreversible degradation of the impacts of climate change are now impacting a large percent of the world. And as we see the world today, there are projections that in the next 8 to 10 years, 65 to 70% of the population of the world will be living in urban areas. And I think there are three things. One, that we don't have a choice now. We've been talking about mitigation and, doing something about this for the last 30 years. The narrative, I believe, has to change completely. We have our laws in place, and we have legislation. We have the governance mechanisms. But for some reason, they simply are not working. And the three reasons, I think, for them not being able to give people a better life on this planet, and I will then come to answer your questions, Dr. Bushra. I think one, of course, is the impact that we're facing. The second is that it is critical to have equitable dispensation of good governance. And third is the all-inclusive model, the collective model of civil society, the public and private sector, the corporate sector, the industrial sector, joining hands now for sustainability and for posterity and for generations to come. So these are the three critical factors, I think, that need to be integrated in trying to find solutions. I think urbanization, our craft and expertise lies within the making of cities and looking at people, providing them with integrated systems of mobility, clean water and clean air. So years ago, you mentioned the Lahore Bachao Tehreek. I happened to be the president. I think I was the president of the Institute of Architects, or maybe I became the president later. But I got a message on my phone that they were going to cut 30,000 trees on Lahore has a canal running through it, Dr. Lee. And that canal has green belts and is a public trust. It belongs to the people of Lahore. It's a sacred public trust. And I got a little message saying that they were going to cut over 30,000 trees and remove several thousand acres of green cover to make a double highway, 4 lanes each on both sides of the canal. And now this canal runs in the center of the city. And so it was mind-boggling why someone would want, this was a very divisive project, because if we had a motorway, 8 lanes on either side of the canal, the city would have been destroyed. No one could have crossed it. Nothing could have been done. And so next day we saw red crosses on trees that were like 80 years old, 100 years old, mango trees and fruit trees that had been there for, since Lahore, which is 5,000 years old and a very historic city. That the canal had really been like the lifeline and the lungs of the city. And we saw these red crosses on them. So for me, I think that what inspired me, Dr. Bushra, I think that I've always been, nature, the environment has been a part of my DNA. And it was something that was unbearable. And it was something that needed correction and needed correction immediately. So I didn't know what to do. And so I took my phone and I sent a message to 30 people, just a message. Please join me at 4 o'clock at this venue. They are going to cut the trees of Lahore. And that is where the journey really began. There were about 100 people who showed up and they were so enthusiastic, and you will not believe, it still rings in my ears. Each one of them said, we were waiting for someone to call us. And that is when something hit home really hard, that we all want good for everyone, but people are hesitant because there is so much resistance, both within the system and outside of it, that people feel that they would rather spend their time doing something else, although they're very passionate about it. And so that day, at that tea table, the Lahore Bachao Tehreek was formed, and we talked to the media. What happened is really interesting. And I think this is a story that it's nice to share this story with the people of the world, because what happened is that the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of Pakistan took suo motu notice of what we were saying and why we were saying it, and summoned us to the Supreme Court. Now, I had never entered a court in my life before. And, I was a little intimidated walking into the chambers of the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. But we were assured that this was something that the people of this country had initiated. And so he converted it into a case in the Supreme Court where we didn't have a lawyer. And as just citizens, we didn't even have any money. So everyone put in a few pennies for petrol to going to Islamabad and coming back. We, of course, got the best lawyers in the country to work pro bono for us. And then the magic happened. And the magic was that there were hundreds of organizations, networks, public, private, NGOs, just even people on their own. Each one of them came and said, we want to join you. We want to join you. We'll be behind you. We will support this movement. And so we had a large network of about 50 or 60 organizations that were supporting the Lahore Bachao Tehreek. We got, before we got a lawyer, I think this went on for 2 years, but before we got a lawyer, I had never stepped into a court, but I used to go and speak in front of the Chief Justice of the country. And it was a humbling experience, because all we were doing was speaking the truth about what belonged to the people. And we based our argument on Article 9 and Article 14 of the Constitution of Pakistan, which Article 9 is the right to life, and Article 14 is the right to dignity for each citizen. And so we talked about the degradation of the environment. We spoke about breach of sacred public trust. We spoke about governance now actually working for people so that it could be a people-centric, democratic dispensation of justice. And we realized that we were beginning to talk about everything that concerns humankind. Clean air, clean water, air pollution. Rafay mentioned earlier The life expectancy in Lahore today is 8 years less for every Lahori. We are spending millions of dollars on mitigations, and we have so many deaths due to respiratory and other diseases. So the whole impact of the movement, we got a fantastic lawyer, which was pro bono. And we actually won the case after 2 years of going to court with people. We were in the media, we were on television, it became a big thing. And quite inadvertently, it was not a planned decision. It was not something that we had sat down and made a strategy. I think it came from the heart. And it came with the intention to be able to do something with we had professionals, we had lawyers, we had the best economists in Pakistan, we did studies, and I'm happy to share that we had thousands of pages of recommendations based on technical expertise that we provided to the court as alternatives. We spoke about the issue. We spoke about the fact that 90%, the density of Lahore, 90% live in 10% of the area, and 10% of the population live in 90% of the footprint of Lahore. So there is a visible inequity when we talk about making motorways in cities, cutting the trees and removing green cover, which are the lungs for those people. So we finally got a judgment, which was a milestone judgment and the first in Asia, which ordered the Punjab government to enact a law through parliament for the first time ever on natural heritage. And of course, we were following, UNESCO had just declared that heritage was not just built heritage, but that it was also natural heritage and built heritage. So this judgment came at a time when the act was in place, and it was called the Lahore Canal Urban Heritage Park Act. And this was, I believe, 2013 or 14. And this act then led the way. It became a precedent for so many cases which were environment related, because in those 2 years at court, as you can imagine, a lot of things regarding, and Rafay has spoken about this as well, a lot of things regarding dispensation of governance. How does the EPD, the Environment Protection Department, run? It was being run by a lawyer. He was not even an environmentalist. What are the rules of business? How do we bring in systems that can synergize and that can build capacities to enable the functioning of the city in terms of the urban-rural migrations, the mobility factor, the water, where the roads need to be, what the zoning is? How do we restrict, how do we make boundaries for this city? And so when this Urban Heritage Act came in, it was an extremely stringent and a very strict legal dispensation where they could not now touch a single tree. They could not remove any of the green cover, and it was declared a public trust. And I shared a small presentation with Dr. Bushra. Dr. Lee, I'm not sure if you have it, but there are clippings from media and the press, and there are photographs in that, in which it said that the people of Lahore have come together for the first time to show the world that citizens can make a difference. And that the Supreme Court, in its judgment of about 400 pages, I believe, or more, many pages talked about the fact that the strongest denominator in change in the world were the people. And that when people got together, and people who were supported by who knew the law and who knew their rights. They were then invincible. And I think one of the things I'd like to point out here is that we realized during this process, and after that, we're still working. We've had several other cases in the Supreme Court. We've had judgments that have been groundbreaking. We realized that the people, 80 to 90% of the people do not know what their rights are. They have no idea that the Food Authority has banned styrofoam and plastics, that they cannot give food in it anymore. The entire city, even today, when you go out, you get food in styrofoam cups, you have plastic, whilst the Food Authority has made a law several years ago completely banning this. So when I go out and I see someone using plastic and I tell them, you know, the Food Authority has banned this item and I can have your shop closed tomorrow morning, they immediately withdraw. They immediately remove the plastic, and if they have a paper cup, they give that to me. I think the point I'm trying to make is that the precedent that the people of Lahore set by making this collective model for dispensing good governance, upholding the law, and of course, improving life on the planet, had extremely far-reaching results. In the fact that today, and for many years now, yes, one other thing I'd like to mention is the media. We never lobbied with the media. We never went out to call them. Of course, we did contact them and we gave them evidence. But you know, the media became our best promoters. Every day there was something in the media. Every day I would get a call. Ma'am, is there anything that you would like us to print? Because, and I would say, you know, we're so humbled and overwhelmed that you call us every day. Why do you do that? And the answer was because we're all human, right? And that is where humanity as a whole, the empathy that we carry for each other and for generations to come, you know, is displayed. And the answer was that, ma'am, we call you because what all of you are doing is not for yourself. It's for a cause that is much bigger. It is not only for the people of Lahore and Pakistan, but it is for the people of the world to see that they can make a difference. And as the media, we would like to support you as much as we can in taking the message across to collectively. Now, what started happening with this, it was so interesting that even the judiciary, when they saw television programs and newspaper clippings and, you know, they saw children on the road, and it was just so exciting that even the judiciary began to talk about it. And there have been, I believe that we are still quoted in so many cases in the Supreme Court and the High Court, where they talk about the proactive effort of the people of Lahore for bringing a better quality of life for everyone. So luckily, we still have most of the green cover and most of those trees, although they did try to widen at least some of it, but it was illegal and they knew it. So yes, since then, the government, I mean, we have always been held our hand out to them. It has never been acrimony as such. But we noticed that soon enough, the government started calling us and asking for our opinions. The Environment Protection Department calls us regularly. Please come over and have a look at our plastic policy. Please come and advise us, tell us what to do. And although we do a lot of that, there is still much to be done. So essentially, I hope I've answered your question, Dr. Bushra, and also regarding the networks that we created, you know, which had a trickle-down effect because we're talking now of taking this message down to grassroots, taking it down to the community. where water in Lahore is about 80% of the water in Lahore has arsenic and lead in it. And these are people who are lower income populations that do not have access to filtered water or, of course, not to bottled water. So the whole cycle of living in a city where you have toxic vegetables, we know that the fruit and vegetables in Lahore are carcinogenic. We know that the air we breathe is now so toxic that the eyes burn. We know that it is integrated that 85% of this comes from vehicular emissions. And here we have a city who 15 years ago wanted to make motorways in the middle of the city. And so we have consistently tried to very logically and very professionally stand up, and I think we can share thousands of pages, Dr. Lee, with Purdue or anyone else who may want them, in recommendations, in committees that were formed, in commissions that took place. So I believe that it, at least for me, it has been a very humbling and a very incredible experience that brought home the inner passion, I think, that I always had, to be able to use the expertise that I had for something which was so much bigger than myself.
Thank you, Ms. Timana. You are currently heading the Climate Change, Environment and Sustainability Initiative at Beacon House University, National University, Lahore. So you are directly engaged with the youth, and especially the educated one. So what role can youth and civil society organization play in advocating for stronger climate action and environmental justice in Pakistan?
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you for your question. I think it's very pertinent since we are dealing with the youth a lot. So I was asked to put together a vision and a strategic framework for climate change, environment, and sustainability at BNU. I was initially asked to come in and give a couple of very small deliverables on climate. And my reaction to that was that unless we have an integrated vision and a strategic framework which cuts across the board, which is based on climate action, because we've had too much talk now, it will be putting the cart before the horse, and it's pointless to do it. So the next meeting I had with the Vice Chancellor, who was very, very dynamic, Dr. Moeed Yusuf, he, of course, said, well, if you really believe that, why don't you go ahead and do it? And it was a huge challenge, and a challenge that I accepted, and I'm very happy that I did so. Although I've had sleepless nights trying to configure a very ambitious climate action program, which we are now rolling out. So we decided that we would not stay myopic and sort of, limited to a smaller frame, but we started getting in touch with all the universities, Pakistan, all the provinces, starting from Balochistan, going up to Gilgit, Swat, Baltistan. So we contacted, and I felt that the academic network was very, very important, and that we should, whatever model we make. So we had decided to make a model which we would share with all academic institutions so that they could start scaling it out on ground, both within academia and outside of academia. And so then we also decided that we would get in touch with we would have international collaboratives. So we are now associated with Harvard and MIT and Columbia, and with the SDSN, which is the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, which is a UN organization headed by Professor Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia. It has about 180 educational institutions that are networked with other sector networks within it. And Dr. Lee, we would love to collaborate with Purdue. So we started this rolling out this very ambitious, we made a charter for the youth. We made something called the Climate Action Coalition. And the Climate Action Coalition was all the students. And they started reaching out to the youth chapters in all the other universities. We made a charter, and the charter is now being shared across the country for the youth. And the charter also, and then in the strategic framework, we made a model of targets. And the targets were to go, of course, towards net zero, to go and no plastic, to reduce paper, to have clean fuel, to use renewable energy, to have e-vehicles, to segregate the waste and recycle it. And so this model now talks about also can be extended to policy making within Pakistan, within the Punjab, within the Federation. And so, yes, we feel that the collective model of youth now being engaged with someone in Spain or Japan or France, being connected to someone in Balochistan or the Punjab or in the frontier or Swat, is quite a remarkable and very interesting happening, because they come with very different frames of mind and very different cultural and local backgrounds, but the overarching issues are the same. The overarching issues are always that there is air pollution, there are no waste treatment plants, what do we do with, how do we transition to a clean fuel, how do we address industry? I mean, how do you convince industry to start dispensing Euro 4 and 5 and 6 and 7 when we are still using Euro 2 here? Although we have an Oil Refinery Act that says that Euro 2 is bad, you cannot use it. But I will come back to the point that Rafay also made earlier, that the checks and balances and compliance to the law is the mechanism of compliance is extremely important. And, because there is so much resistance to that, we move 10 feet ahead and we go back a few feet, but we do manage to scale up at least, 6 feet of movement ahead of that. And at one point, we were thinking, what is the solution to this? And I thought that, well, why don't we have so many ministries, right? We have the Ministry of Climate Change, we have the Ministry of Health, we have the Ministry of Transport, we have the Ministry of... Why do we not have a ministry for compliance? For compliance to every regulation that is made within the country. And of course, we were talking about the environment and climate change and sustainability, where big pharma comes in, where big industry comes in, where we have mining going on, where we have cement plants, which are within protected areas illegally. So why do we not have, I think that one of the solutions is to have a powerful and strong ministry or some way of compliance. But then again, we come back to priorities within governance systems. And so I would say that we have moved quite far ahead in terms of the awareness, the media being there, the youth now talks about it. The youth is now beginning to do things that we never imagined. They're walking out and getting, sourcing e-vehicle, little e-scooties. We had some on campus the other day. And, they said we must begin to reduce vehicles that come in. They need to have health checks. We need catalytic converters. And so what we tell them is that there is a way to do this. And the way is to have transition maps where we can ease out into a better system. Because we have, through experience, I've seen that every time we did something overnight, there was a billboard ban. And there was a two-stroke, we have rickshaws in our country, which are tuk-tuks in the rest of the world. And there were huge emissions coming out of these tuk-tuks. And about 12 years ago, the government and all of we decided that they should convert to four-stroke, where there are no emissions. But unfortunately, the law was passed overnight. And so the repercussions of that were not very pleasant, because you can't, systems, we believe, have to have transition maps that can assist them. The regulation, a lot of laws need to be revised. Several new laws need to be made, especially with regard to bylaws, bylaws for the city, for example, where we can talk about, we've just had a new bylaw put in, where we were talking about this for years, and we said, when you give an approval for anyone to build a house in any society, they have to plant 2 trees before they start building the house, within the premises or outside in the green belt. And that is now a bylaw. And that bylaw, you can imagine the carbon footprint, the sort of public spaces we have, particularly in Lahore. We lost 75% of ground cover, green cover and trees in the last 10 years. It is absolutely mind-boggling that 75% disappeared and we converted from brown to green. So we are bringing in policies where regulations have to be put in place, where there are no brown to green conversions, where at least 30% of the area of every housing scheme should be green through mandatory law, where the fuel has to be Euro 4, 5, or 6, where we do not make motorways that are choking. In Lahore, to get from one neighborhood to the other, it takes close to 2 hours now. And people are, I think that the economy, it's of course related to the socio-economic condition. Because when people do not have well-being in a city, do not have clean water, they're in a health emergency, they do not have mobility, we have hardly any public transport here. And so we also want that public transport should now be a mandatory provision, that we have no footpaths in Lahore, where we would like people to walk. The 80% that do not have access to vehicles must have footpaths. They must have integrated public transport. And so as we speak, we are now creating awareness amongst the youth, because it is this generation that is going to lead the green movement. And so we call it an eco-smart movement, an eco-smart city. So yes, Dr. Abida, I would say that there is a sea change in terms of how younger people are now beginning to take the initiative to take this agenda forward. And we're very, very happy about it. And we hope that we can learn from the rest of the world and also share with them, our journey and our story and our framework, the model, which is a collective. We wish to share it with every university in Pakistan and every university around the globe, because the time has come for all of us to be holding hands on the climate issue. It is not about mitigation anymore. It is about climate justice, about climate action. And at the end of the day, I think people realize that it is about breathing. It's about not going to a hospital. It's about eating something that, you don't get sick with. So I hope that this is something that we know that the world is talking about it. We also know that there's a lot of greenwashing. But amidst all of that, from the day we started, we have been extremely positive. And as I speak today, I am so confident. I just wanted to, by the way, mention one other thing, which is very interesting, which is the integration of AI as a tool. So we have someone who's done a doctorate in AI and is looking at climate systems. And when we saw the simulations that could be made for heat islands, for green areas, for example, if a city should have 40%, and at the moment we have 20, this algorithm can immediately tell you that these are the open public spaces where you can plant 20% more. And at the touch of a button, AI, which is a double-edged sword, we all know. AI can be very, very difficult. But AI can also, I believe, the positive side of AI integration is something we need to talk about in climate action. And so we are, in simple terms, I would say that we are able to predict the future and make the future today. If we know that these are the areas where you can go out and put Miyawaki forests, and in a year, your air pollution level, your AQI will drop from 600 to 100 because of the carbon footprints, the cleaning of the air. Why can we not do it? And so that is what we're working on these days, the AI climate nexus, where we hope to create a little model that we can take to the Environment Department, to the Climate Change Ministry at the federal level, and hopefully share with the world. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Imrana. What has happened in Lahore is inspiring for, I think, the entire world. The success that you've had in changing the policies and having an effect on the environment in Lahore can be extended globally. And the idea that you have a climate action coalition that includes universities from around the world. At the same time, I'm reminded of what Rafay said at the beginning about government and corporate structures that kind of interfere with compliance. I know that in the case of Israel's genocide in Palestine, the US has blocked and has not complied with international law. In fact, they have violated their own laws that are on the books in the United States. I also would say that I note that Israel uses AI as a means of killing more Palestinians.
Yeah.
So I think what you say about AI is accurate, that it's a double-edged sword. And to me, the only thing that will save AI is if the public controls AI and its algorithms. Without public control, without democratic control over that, it will be misused, as demonstrated by the US and Israel and other places. I just wanted to ask you a question about what do you think is the role of international cooperation, which may mean academically, like with the Climate Action Coalition, or in others, in supporting Pakistan's fight against climate change, in particular, securing financing, climate financing, and also a technology transfer. I wondered if you could speak to those two things. What's the role of international cooperation to supporting Pakistan's fight against climate change?
Well, I think that the international cooperation that we're looking for, I think they have a huge role to play, because our emissions are less than 1%, and yet we are in the 7 most vulnerable countries to be hit by climate change. The role of the international sector, I think, really is critical in understanding that Pakistan has some of the, has probably the highest number of glaciers in the world, as Rafay also mentioned, and that the floods that we had earlier, which were absolutely devastating, can happen again. So yes, Pakistan is at climate risk. We are in the red zone for water. There is a need here for cooperation with other countries where they can come and support I would say a strong climate action program. Whether it is talking about waste treatment, or it's talking about air pollution, or it's talking about vehicular emissions, or the bringing in capacity to be able to reflect on this. And well, the time to reflect is gone, to be able to take action on this. I think that the Loss and Damages Fund at the COP last year was something that was initiated by Pakistan. And we hope that we can, that can now begin to roll itself out and assist whichever country may need, help in trying to avert the crisis. Because Dr. Lee, we do know definitively today that climate in one part of the globe impacts the opposite part of that globe as well. And we learned this because when we had air pollution levels went up, and they said, oh, it's the burning of stubble from India, which is coming into Pakistan. So we did some scientific research, and we found a scientific study that said it was absolutely shocking. And I could have never believed it till I saw that report. And it said, well, 10% is coming from Russia, 5% is coming from Croatia, 3% is coming from Iran, because of the patterns of the wind patterns in the world have changed, right? And they're very unpredictable. So I think one of the things that we need to understand is that we are now, the planet is now being impacted together. It's not about one country doing something and the other not being impacted. So it's very important to have international collaboration. Secondly, you asked about university, collaborations, and that is extremely critical as well. We would love to have as many global partners, as I mentioned earlier, both to share and to learn. And once we have that, and we have a very strong, powerful network base, I totally agree with you. That is very, it's an uphill task because of the industry, because of the billions and trillions of dollars of vested interest that people have, so that this doesn't happen, and that the model remains within the ambit of some system which is not working anymore. But if we get together and we make the collective model, both for the youth, for the public-private sector, for people across the board, and begin to help each other collectively, I truly believe we can make an impact, and we can make that impact very, very soon. Having said that, yes, AI and the world, I was just saying to someone, and I think a lot of people who will share this thought, that there is humankind, really, I don't know if we still want to call it humanity anymore, because there seems to be very little semblance of humanity on the planet now. And this is something that we have to bring back. This is nurturing the earth, the planet, our generations, to learn that violence is not the way to go forward, that we have to collectively bring, the larger interpretation of togetherness and of collective, equitable and just, transparent dispensation of resources. Because at the end of the day, I think from Africa all the way to the Sahara, to Asia. People just want a good life. I think the top 5% are embroiled in what I would say political dispensation and vested interests, but the rest of the 90% are just people who become collateral damage, who then suffer because of the impacts of climate change, since that is our topic today. But then the wider ambit, as we have mentioned today in our session, is frightening. It's almost unreal. It's gone beyond the science fiction movies that we saw when we were kids. And so this is something that absolutely has to stop. It cannot go on. So the answer to that would be that we absolutely have not lost hope, and we never will, and we never should. And so standing collectively, getting the youth, making powerful charters and programs that we can take out and talk about. Yeah, we can reach for the moon, but we will get many stars on the way. And I'm confident that we will one day get the moon as well. Thank you.
Thank you. We had several questions in the Q&A, and Rafay has already typed answers to a few of them, but there are a couple that are still here that I think were directed to Rafay Alam, and also maybe Dr. Imrana would want to speak to him. One of the questions from Saeed Fahad asked the question about injustice in the South. So climate change is not the only thing, but there's also this global injustice and inequality. So I wondered if Dr. Rafay would like to, if Rafay would like to speak to that, and if Dr. Imrana has any comments as well. So let's start with Rafay, if you wanted to speak to that question.
Thank you, Dr. Arts. And Shahzad, that's a good question about climate injustice, exemplified in the case of Pakistan in the 2022 floods, when the rain that fell in Balochistan and Sindh was a man-made incident because of the greenhouse gases historically produced by the global north. And look, Pakistan is just one of many countries that's consistently battered by floods. In 2022, if 30% of Pakistan was flooded, I believe Nigeria was even worse, but there was less levels of flooding. The Philippines was battered by hurricane after hurricane. Countries in the global south are facing the brunt of the climate crisis today. There are people who are being deprived of not only of life and property, but livelihoods, all caused by the greenhouse gases, the majority of which have been produced by the global north. And of course, today you've got your developing countries that are producing more and more greenhouse gases. But historically speaking, this has been the issue, which sort of reflects itself in the international law text, the United Nations Framework Convention, Kyoto Protocol, the Paris Agreement, and others, in the form of climate finance. The underlying or the underpinning of climate finance being that developed countries or industrially developed countries owe. This is not a loan. They have an obligation to give money to less developed countries, technology transfer, global climate finance, so that these countries can prepare for what's going to happen to them. And the financing has not been forthcoming. The greenhouse gas reduction of the industrialized nations, the big economies, hasn't been forthcoming. And as a result of the failure of the international community to live by its commitments, the vast majority of the people on Earth are subjected to now increasingly unlivable human conditions. This is a grave injustice. But what can you do about it? Well, the only game in town is the Conference of Parties, the COP, which is going to be next month in Azerbaijan. And that's where, under the UN system, one country, one vote, and consensus decision-making is the way things go ahead. And so what global south countries, developing countries, less developed countries, as they're called, LDCs, small island states, vulnerable countries, have formed together in blocs that lobby during the United Nations COP process towards decision-making. Now, look, we live in a world that is demonstrably unequal. You know, Pakistan has economic issues that tie itself to the United States and, for example, to Saudi Arabia in a way that makes it very difficult for it to stand up at COP and point fingers to the largest oil producing country in the world or one of the largest greenhouse gas emitting countries in the world and say, do this, do this, do this. It becomes very difficult diplomatically for us to do this. You can only do that, so to speak, if you ally with other developed countries and lobby as a bloc. You may think that's inefficient, you may think that's suboptimal, but those are the rules of the only game in town. And that's what COP is. And that's what we've got. And I personally don't think it's enough. I don't think you can solve a problem like climate change, an existential issue for the entire world, by dividing the world into 200 different countries and having them fight with each other and negotiate a solution.
I just wanted to follow up with that because it seems that the problem is that the UN, and COP is included in that, doesn't have a way of enforcing the decisions of the UN. I mean, the General Assembly has said in their overwhelming majority to have a ceasefire in Israel's genocide in Palestine, but that's been blocked by the US, and Israel pretty much ignores the will of the overwhelming majority of the world, just continues to kill people.
And if the UN can't fix Gaza, what chance does it have for a problem that surmounts the world? You know, it really is a question of international law. That this is the canary in the coal mine as far as where the prospects of COPs and a climate solution lie.
I think one of the things that might inspire us or direct us in the proper direction would be what happened with Lahore. When you have a large social movement that brings pressure to bear upon the government institutions and even the political institutions and the corporate structure, even in Lahore, you're able to succeed. Now, that's a huge problem when we get to something like Palestine and the genocide against Palestine. But and it doesn't happen overnight, as both of you have said. But it's a struggle that ultimately it requires large numbers of people uniting together and creating a force that can't be withstood. Dr. Imran, I didn't know if you wanted to speak to this, the question about injustice and inequality in response.
Well, I think that I think that it's very absolutely clear that there is a huge question regarding justice and inequality in just about everything we see in the world today. It's not restricted to climate, and it's something that has sort of become an integral part of everything that we do. And so, yes, the changing the narrative through things like, I guess, you know, COP is one way to look at it. It is not very effective, as we all know. I think that the UN has the mandate that it had to secure world peace needs to be looked at, because we are increasingly in violence, zones of violence, and the world is being subjected to inhuman injustice. So yes, I think the world has to get together and begin to have an alternate narrative here on ways of delivery, where systems need to change. We can't solve the problem with the same way that we always did, right? So there have to be, I would say, perhaps a coalition or a network of think tanks across the world that whose thoughts are aligned and who are on the same page regarding a resolution to all this. And that conversation has to begin and end with a deadline, because it can go on forever. and we don't have the time anymore. So yes, the initiative has to be taken somewhere by someone at some point. And I think what better time than now? And so I would like to suggest perhaps Dr. Abda and Dr. Lee, Rafay and Dr. Bushra, that we sit down and have a little brainstorming session and take some sort of proactive, measures on how we can make a difference beyond that. So that would be my suggestion at this time, in terms of the injustice that the world is facing.
Thank you, Dr. Imrana. One of the questions that was answered, and you can go to the Q&A, was about greenhouse gases, and I thought Rafay's response to that was right on mark. So, but he answered it, and if you go to the Q&A, you can see that there's some questions that have been answered. There were a few that remained. Perhaps the one that remains that might be of interest to us is, what should be on the agenda of climate change activists, net zero or climate justice, which seems to be, because as Dr. Imrana said, the Climate Action Coalition had several ingredients, which included net zero, no plastics, renewable energy, and electric vehicles. But here the question from Shafiq is, should that be part of the climate change activists' agenda, or should it be more directed towards climate justice, which may not necessarily be opposed, but the question is posed that way. So perhaps Rafay and then Dr. Imrana would want to respond to that.
Well, thank you, Shafiq. As I've said, look, the problem isn't climate change. The problem is overconsumption. It's the habits and the way we live. This global civilization that we've evolved to consumes far too much and emits far too much for the earth and its ecosystem to absorb. And as a result, we've destabilized the ecosystem so that it will not be able to support the civilization we are currently enjoying, right? So when it comes to that, when you look at it this way, when you look at literally the millions of people, billions of people who are going to be impacted in the next 40, 50 years, and we're going to live, in the future, we're going to live in a climate unstable world. You know, once the tipping points go, once the AMOC airwaves in the Northern Atlantic go, once the Amazon's ability to absorb carbon and goes, we're at tipping point, and it will never ever be the same again. Seasons will change. We won't have the type of seasons that can sustain large-scale agriculture. There'll be a number of cities on the face of the earth that are close to oceans. Large major capitals around the world are close to rivers and oceans. They'll be subsumed. You know, this will not be able to go on. And so from an academic point of view and a business point of view, I know what net zero is, but from an activist point of view, that is not the solution. The solution is to identify the drivers of the climate crisis, dismantle them and replace them with something that's more equitable. And balance, we're no longer in a world of balance. We have to identify the culprits and the drivers of the climate crisis. We have to reframe a morality where those are the bad guys that have to stop what they're doing or face consequences. We've got to retool how we think. It's going to be a new civilization going forward. And that all falls generally under the rubric of climate justice, which is the way I think we need to head.
Yes, thank you. Dr. Imrana,
I'd just like to add, I completely agree with Rafay. And, we've spoken a lot about the extinction of species, the fifth extinction. And I believe this is yet another extinction of species that needs to take place, because the two are completely interlinked. I think that climate justice and climate action, we can't do one without the other. I think that they're both equally important. We cannot neglect one, thinking that, oh, we work on climate justice and then eventually we'll get something good coming out of it. I believe that they are integrally linked, and that work has to be done on them together, and totally, absolutely the DNA of humankind. I would not call them humankind anymore. I don't even know what we want to call these people, the people of the world, and the trajectory that we're on. Radically, yes, a new civilization has to come into place. We cannot afford to live within the systems which we have perpetuated for the human race to simply self-destruct. And that we're sitting here having these conversations whilst when we see the world around us, it's a nightmare. So looking at on the positive side of it, a lot of work needs to be done. And wherever there are pockets of positivity, or there are pockets of people who believe that, and we all need to believe that there is hope, because that's the only way to make positive action on ground, is to have hope. And so we do. And we know that we can reverse this. It's just a matter of making the dent in a different way. And I hope that collectively and through, through this session today that we have shared with so many people, that we get, ideas, and that we can get together and mobilize for this.
Thank you, thank you. I think that Dr. Abida and Dr. Bushra and I should talk about contacting some of the Climate Action Coalition groups in other countries. And we will have another presentation of One World, One Struggle on climate next month. And everybody, there is another question or two that was posted on Q&A, but because we've gone such a long time, I think we'll ask the people to save that question for our next webinar. And everybody that was on this webinar will be invited and get an announcement for the next one. But I want to thank Rafay and Dr. Imrana, Dr. Abida, Dr. Bushra, and all of the participants that joined us today for being with us and participating in the conversation. I can't thank Rafay and Dr. Imrana enough for your contributions. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And it's really been a pleasure and an honor to be on this session with you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ms. Imrana. Thank you, Ahmad Rafay and Dr. Lee and Dr. Bushra. And it was really wonderful and enlightening session. Hope to see you, inshallah. And I'm hoping to see Sir Ahmad Rafay in our IC regional conference as well. Thank you.
Goodbye, everyone.